So I have my mold and I have that parting line that goes all around the whole sculpture. The mold has hardened and I'm going to put it in water and soak it for about half an hour. I'm leaving it so that the bottom hole is vertical and is at the top so that air bubbles can escape out of it. So it's been about half an hour since I've soaked my mold. Now I inspect it, take it out of the water. Now you can start to see that this line is getting bigger. The clay absorbs water and it expands, and that helps to break the mold apart. I'm going to empty the water out and bring it over to my table here. So I have my mold here, and now I'm going to try to open it up. Phew, and it came apart, and you can see my mold and my clay sculpture. So I have my two pieces here. Now I take my clay out of my mold, just put it to the side. Then I take my molds and I wash them out, trying to clean out all of the clay from inside the mold. Doesn't have to be totally clean. Okay, I'm inspecting my mold and I'm cleaning it out and cleaning out both sides. Then I'm going to soak my molds again for another half an hour. You want your plaster to be saturated with water, because when we put it back together and we pour our plaster back into our mold, if the plaster is dry, the new plaster will be wet, and the new plaster will the water will soak into the dry plaster of this mold and fuse it together. So if we keep this wet as possible, then we can prevent it from sticking to the two sides of the mold sticking together. That's our goal. Okay, let that sit for about half an hour. This is my bag of the clay that I gave you. And notice, to keep the bag sealed, I wrap it around and then put a rubber band around it. This is a nice way to keep it sealed. So I'm opening up my bag of the clay. Then I'm taking my sculpture, my clay sculpture, and recycle this clay. If there's any big chunks of plaster on your clay, take that off and throw that out. Try not to get plaster, and especially newspaper. Do not get newspaper or plaster mixed in with your clay. And break it up into small pieces, put it in your plastic bag, and you can return that, and we reuse that. And then the center of your the newspaper with the masking tape, you can just throw that out. I have mine double bagged to keep it from drying out. If your clay has dried out, poke some holes in the clay, sprinkle some water, and then put it in your bag, and that water will eventually dissolve into the rest of the clay. So I've had my mold soak for 30 minutes on each side. I used a brush to kind of clean out the clay in the inside. So it doesn't have to be perfectly clean. As you can see, my mold still has some clay in. Just making sure I have large chunks of clay out. So I take both sides of my mold out. Then I take a rag and I blot off extra water so that my mold is pretty much dry, just so there aren't puddles of water in there. So next step is to apply a mold release. There's many kinds of mold release. You can actually get mold release. You can use what we've been using at the studio most of the time is Murphy's oil soap. Since I don't have that, I'm using just regular white liquid hand soap. And I put that squeeze that into a small container. Take my brush, take off the extra water, but it's still a little damp. Now I've seen people use vegetable oil, Pam that spray vegetable oil that you can put on, or going to a craft store and getting the mold release. Dipping it in the soap, and then I'm brushing that soap into the sculpture. I'm doing the inside of the sculpture, and I'm also doing the parting line. So parting line is not essential, but it helps to take our molds apart at the end. I brush this on liberally. Not too much so I get puddles of soap, but I want to make sure that I cover the whole surface really well. I am dabbing off any extra soap so it's not puddling up. Got the whole thing well soaked up. Take my soap and I put it on the other side. Got it going on the other side here. Making sure that I cover everything in the inside and that parting wall. Liberally putting it on. Then, when I got the whole thing covered, I let that soak in a little bit. Go back to my first side. Kind of dab off any extra soap. Okay. Let this side soak in too. You can see I got some excess soap on this side, so I lightly dab it off so there aren't any puddles, and taking off the soap that hasn't soaked in. Okay, I'm going to do this a few times. I'm going to come back to my sides and I'm going to reapply soap. We want to do this 3 or 4 times. Seems like a lot, but I want to make sure that my molds don't stick. So you can repeat this 3 to 4 times. When you take your molds apart and you separate it, inspect the insides. Sometimes there are air pockets, and you'll see that inside the mold itself and sometimes on the parting wall. So after you apply the soap, then take some firm clay and fill in any of those air pockets with clay. So I've applied 4 coats on my mold. My last coat, I'm just letting it sit on here without wiping it off. Taking some water, filling up this yogurt container only about this way because I only need a little bit of plaster. And you'll see in a minute, even this is probably too much. Sifting the plaster in here. You don't need to slip into this plaster. Just mix up a small amount and let that plaster sit on the surface before you mix it up. And I'm letting it really mound up on the surface of this here. Okay, a little bit more plaster on. Stick my hand in it again and mix it up. This time I'm using warm water because I want it to harden quickly. Okay, mixing that up. I set that to the side, let that harden. Wash my hand out in my bucket of water. Then, while I'm waiting for that plaster to harden, I'm going to take my molds and I'm going to wipe off that excess soap. Don't wipe it off too much, just dab it until you get off only the excess amount. You don't want to dry it out. We're dabbing off the excess amount so that we don't lose any detail. But you don't wipe it all off so it completely dries. Okay. Then we are going to put our 2 pieces of our mold back together. And then we are going to take this plaster once it gets thick enough, and all we're doing is we're sealing up this parting lines around the edge here. So I'm going to wait for this plaster to get. So my plaster is starting to get hard. So I take my plaster and I want to seal all around this parting line here. So I apply plaster to that parting line. Doesn't need to be very thick. As you can see, I've already gotten some on here. Okay, so you don't want to get it over the whole sculpture. Only needs to be maybe 1/4 inch thick, that plaster that you put on that parting line. This is to seal it so that when we pour plaster in the inside, it doesn't leak out. You don't want to put too much on so that it gets difficult to take the mold apart, but you don't want the mold to come apart while you're pouring your plaster into it. I think I'm making this between 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch thick, and maybe it's about 1.5 inches wide, that line that I have that goes all around the sculpture. My parting wall has hardened. I put some rubber bands around it to hold it just in case. You can put rope around it. You can put masking tape or tape around it, anything to hold it. Just put a few pieces around to keep it so that it doesn't come apart. Then find some way that you can keep it vertical, and we're going to mix up plaster and we're going to pour it down the hole here. So I'm using my plaster container here and I'm going to hold that upright. Now, I think all I need is about this much plaster to fill this mold. If whatever container you use, make sure you do not fill water more than halfway. If you fill water more than halfway, it's going to overflow the top because it about doubles once you put the plaster in. So I'm going to take my plaster and I'm going to sift it over the top of my water. So it covers the top of the water. Hopefully I mixed enough. I estimated enough here. Mix in the plaster again so it just starts to mound on the surface of the water. Okay. Mix it with your hand again. And once we get it nice and mixed, we want to pour it in before it gets thick. That way we catch all the details in our mold. I'm kind of squeezing it with my hand to get out the lumps of plaster. Once I get out the lumps of plaster, while it's still in a very liquid consistency, then I pour it down that hole. That's why we have our pouring cup. So we pour it in to our mold. And we want to pour it in so that it covers the top of our mold. Wash my hand off here. Now I'll show you how that looks from the inside. Okay, so I poured my plaster into the top of it so it sits on the surface of that pouring cup. If you have shoulders on, pour it so make your mold level. and then pour your plaster in so it's flat, and that will be your flat surface that will that your mold will sit on, or your final sculpture will sit on. And then give it a little shakes to make sure that you have any air bubbles out of it. You can even take a barbecue skewer, something that you have, and you can stick it in here and mix it around to make sure that you have any air pockets out of it. Okay, and that's it for this process. And now we just let this sit until it hardens, and then we're going to break the mold apart, and that will be our final sculpture. I am out here in my studio. I've gotten my hardened mold. I've waited 1 day for it to harden. I would suggest waiting probably more than 1 day. I got some cloth here to cushion my sculpture. I got a chisel and a hammer. You could use a screwdriver and hammer, anything that you have to break off your mold. I'm tapping my mold lightly, and as you can see, I'm tapping it vertical to my mold, and I tap it off, and you can see the difference in the color between the mold and the sculpture itself. I'm going around that bottom pouring cup. That way I can tell where my sculpture is. Be careful. I just chipped my sculpture here because I went a little too strongly. So go slowly. Take off a little at a time. So you can kind of see I'm going around, I'm following my sculpture from the bottom, going up. And I'm chipping it off pretty much perpendicular to my mold. What you got to be careful of is when you get to the head, when you get to the chin, that you can nick your sculpture, because it's hard to tell how thick where your mold is. Okay, my mold is starting to get exposed, so I know where I need to go. Where not to hit my mold. And I just patiently go around the whole sculpture. Because I've put that slip in, I'm able to see the difference from the sculpture itself and the outside mold. The nose and the ears are very fragile, and you might break off pieces. If you break off any pieces, you can save those pieces and we can glue them back on. If not, you can resculpt them with the plaster, just like we did with the organic form. Looks like I chipped a little tip of the nose off, so I'm going to have to repair that. When I get to the top here, pretty confident. Just tap that off. Got my sculpture out. Got my mold pretty much off. Now I will take it inside for the final repairs. Now my sculpture is finished. If I want to cut off, I don't have much left of that pouring cup, but if I have that pouring cup on and I want to cut it off, I take my saw and I saw my plaster at the bottom to make a nice clean cut. So that's the way my sculpture is going to end at the bottom. If I want to make a base, that will be the next step. If I would like, I could just sit it on the surface and maybe I don't need a base. If you have shoulders on, you don't need a base at all. Now to clean up your sculptures, you want to use your clay tools. This is the tool that I recommend. So we want to scrape away that parting line around the whole sculpture. I just want to clean it up so we don't have that parting line. We can scrape off any clay. We can wash our mold or our sculpture in water to clean off that clay. I damaged my ear because my back wall collapsed. So if I wanted to, I could re-carve into that ear. Repairing your sculpture. If there's parts that you need to repair, say your nose chipped off and you wanted to remold your sculpture, what you would do is you would wet your sculpture and then you would mix up a tiny bit of new plaster and apply it to your sculpture. If your sculpture, if you wet it, it will be easier for to sculpt any new plaster that you add to it. If you don't, and your sculpture is dry, it will absorb all the water out of your new plaster that you're adding, and it will harden very quickly and will be difficult to sculpt. So what we do is we either soak our sculpture, or we take a sponge and we sponge on water to it. If you have any air pockets, you can do the same thing, fill them in with plaster. If you have any notches, like I have air pocket here, I have a notch that I chipped when I was breaking off the mold. I can wet my sculpture, mix up a little plaster, and then fill in those spots. I have some plaster here left over, and I can fill in those air pockets. And I didn't bother to soak it or to wet it, but I would suggest you do that. And then any parts that I chipped and I need to fill in, I will add plaster there. Try to get it as smooth as I can, and when it dries, I'll come back and clean it up again. Okay, so that's one way to repair your sculpture. The other option is if you have a piece that broke off. Say this bun broke off when I was chipping the mold off. I would save that piece, and then I would use glue. And I recommended getting that Duco cement as glue to glue it back on. Now, when you use glue, it's the opposite. You want your sculptures, you want both pieces to be as dry as possible. The drier it is, the better that the plaster will adhere to each other. A couple ways you could do that. You can wait a few days for it to dry off, put it close to a heater, and that will dry it off quicker. You could use a hair dryer to dry it quicker. You could stick it in an oven at like a very low temperature, like 200 degrees, and dry it out quickly. And then you can make sure that it cools down, and then put some glue on both sides, put it together, put some tape around it, and let that harden. And then if there's a crack line around there, then you wet your sculpture again, mix up some new plaster, and then you can fill in that crack with new plaster. So I'm making my base for my sculpture. I'm going to make a round base, and I'm going to pin it to this base. I'm going to drill a hole up here and then place the pin into the plaster. I got a chopstick. I'm going to cut off the end here. And my chopstick, I'm going to make it so it goes into the sculpture about this deep, and then goes into the base about this deep. So I'm going to cut it off about where my thumb is. Okay, I got my base here. I got a drill. It's about the thickness of this. I am going to drill it through my sculpture. Now, I have my parting line here. So my parting line is going to be, I'm going to hold that parting line vertical. And then I'm going to make sure that I have my drill lined up. So I'm going through the center of the bottom. right through the center here, and making my drill so it is vertical this way and that it follows my parting line. My parting line is clear on this side, having my parting line vertical. And I'm going to drill. Into my sculpture. See that my pin fits in there. See, the reason why I'm doing that vertical is because this parting line, when it stands, pretty much when we cast it, that parting line is vertical. So we want to keep that so it doesn't tilt. That's why I drilled in straight following that parting line. Now for my base, I am taking a yogurt container. I put a little soap in the inside. Take another yogurt container and I filled it with water, only about this much. Because my base, I'm going to fill this up with plaster, and my base, I want it maybe about this tall, so that's all the plaster that I need. Take my plaster, same method, mix up my plaster, using warm water again so it settles quicker. My plaster in here, mix that up. Take this plaster, pour it into my other yogurt container. Pretty much using up all the plaster that I mixed. I'm going to make that plaster so it is nice and settled, nice and smooth on the top there. Wash my hands. I'm going to let that plaster settle, and then I'm going to stick my pin into that base while it hardens. The plaster that I have mixed is starting to harden, so I take my pin, my chopstick that I had cut down, and I put it in the center of that plaster and make sure it's vertical, and then I just wait for that to harden. So now my plaster is hardened in my container. I gently loosen it from the sides of the container and the bottom of the container. Press it out from my container. I have my base. And I take my head, put it on my base, and I have my sculpture complete.